this idea of problems and how to solve problems more effectively, what it means to truly define a problem, and even like how our perceptions sometimes impact our ability to solve problems. And you know, when I teach the coach the client, not the problem class, I always get a lot of questions, but the most common one I get is, how am I helping my client solve a problem if I'm not focused on the problem? And so I'm curious, like, what would you say to that?
Yeah, this gets at the heart of coaching because this really is what coaching is about, or the premise of coaching from the client standpoint. From the coach's standpoint, the premise is listening empathetically and actively enough, and is curiosity enough. And the corollary to that is that if you do that, then you're also bringing in an empowerment basis of coaching, rather than a knowledge basis. So the difference is, an empowerment basis looks at building up a client's skill set and knowledge of self and mindfulness and character strengths, things like that. Like, that's an empowerment basis. A knowledge basis looks at giving ideas, insights, things like that, things that are also useful, but looking at it from the standpoint of what are, like, what's on the outside, like what are the, if we're looking at hope theory, what are the pathways? What are the things that you need in the pathway in order to solve this problem? Both are useful. Both are useful. I'm not saying that, looking at the problem or trying to problem solve is not useful. It's just, when you're looking at a problem, when you're coaching someone that's, from an empowerment basis, but you're looking at the problem and you start to try to problem solve or offer advice or your own expertise or ideas about things, from a coaching standpoint, you start breaking down the empowerment basis. The meta message is, if a coach does that, offers advice, is you don't have the internal resources, or you don't have the resources yourself to solve it. And that breaks the coaching process down. So it's a little bit of it's a leap of faith often for the coach and the client to say, you know what, we're going to not try to solve this problem right away or at all, but we're going to try to get curious about it and see what insights come up about myself, what strengths I have, what's that inner world like, how am I even grappling with this thing. Those insights are so valuable, like wildly valuable. And the premise of coaching is that those insights that you gain are going to be more valuable than if the problem were solved.
Mm.
It's not comfortable. It's not easy. And when I think of it and apply it to my own life and the clients' lives I've seen, it's hard. It doesn't. This is not to minimize pain or to minimize the problem or to minimize the things. It's not that at all. It's being with the problem, but not having the same habitual reaction to it. Instead of judging yourself, instead of trying to judge the situation and feeling bad and going into that tailspin, which is natural. I'm there too. Instead of doing that, it's what a coach can do is help a client be with a challenging situation without this habitual like ideas or habitual like emotional mental swirl. Instead, just calm it all down, be with, get curious, and usually something comes out of it. Some insight comes out of it. And that insight will start to unravel the problem in an unexpected way.
Mm.
And I've seen it again and again, over and over. Yeah, it's just trusting the process. And once that happens enough, then it becomes an additional capacity. It definitely feels like, yeah, capacity is a good word for it. It feels like there's an additional space for problems to be without the usual without the usual like reflexive reaction to it. You know.
It almost reminds me of, something that I talk about with clients and new coaches, especially, is the idea that problems can't be solved without properly defining them. And so sometimes I talk about that from the perspective of, self-awareness. And I always share the example of, students who picked a major but don't necessarily want that major. They don't know it yet, but they changed their major their junior year because they never did the exploration that you were just talking about to get those insights to determine, what they wanted to do. And it reminds me of a quote. We've talked about this quote before too, by Albert Einstein. And it's, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about solutions. So I'm curious how you would say that translates to the coaching world.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it was Einstein as well. And this might be a misquote, but the idea is that we can't solve a problem with the same kind of thinking that created it, right? So
Yes, that is him too.
there's this element of, okay, so what level are we dealing with here? And there is, I mean, on a I don't know, coachy level, like a lot of these problems, like when I'm at my very best, like when I've got my own, exercised, hydrated, did morning routine, all those things, uh, there is a perspective that's available of being grateful even for the challenges. And there was something like, let's use writing for as an example. Um, I Stephen Pressfield. Uh, he's some books are good, some of not, but whatever. He's prolific and he produces and he ships and fine. Uh, there was a newsletter or I got of his. There was a quote that talked about, or a story he was saying. He met a writer who was successful, done this work. He was going through a hard time, and he asked for advice. He said, "I'm really struggling right now," and this kind of thing. And the advice was, he's from this other author said he's never known a writer whose writing has suffered based on the writer's struggle. That struggling writers who struggle sometimes with life and these kinds of things actually end up it improves the writing. It brings a humanity, it brings a depth, it brings a pathos. This isn't that I'm not saying like, yay, go out and struggle and suffer and be, it's not that, but it's an allowing of being with the hurt, of being with the pain, of being with. And this is, I mean, this is, going to the difference between counseling and coaching, and you think about, okay, so are we really doing, when does this get into therapy if we're talking about pain and suffering and being with these kinds of things? For me, the biggest difference is I'm not trying to diagnose, I'm not trying to fix, I'm not trying to solve, I'm not trying to, go down this fits patterns of, this fits patterns of, you know, um, dysfunction that recognizing this is where it goes, which I understand, and I think that it's really valuable for coaches to have professional partnerships with counselors. Like it's a really valuable, and when I had my private practice, I did, and it was really useful. And I didn't talk to her like that often, but often enough that we kept pulse and I could run things by her, and it was great. Uh, from going and looking at the idea of being with, it really helps to have a support network and be able to talk things out. And coaching does that in a way that there's, you just don't have a judgment around it. It's more about curiosity. And when you go there, the problem, if we go with the problem, it tends to shift away from the external circumstances. When you're focusing, coaching the problem, the external circumstances become the most important thing. When you're in a coaching session and you're focusing on the client, the attention shifts where you're using those external circumstances as a stressor to make other things show up that might not have shown up. You make cracks in your, cracks in your being. I don't know. There are cracks in the way that, things show up, like weaknesses show up in starker relief. Even strengths show up in starker relief. Like the pressure helps you see things that you can improve more clearly. And when you start thinking about asking yourself, how is this problem showing me my strengths and weaknesses? Now you're looking at your being again. That's coaching the client. So it's not like the problem, I'm not ignoring the problem, but I'm using the problem to help bring out those characteristics in starker relief so that we can coach around them, gather an insight, and then reapply it to the problem and see what happens. So then it becomes almost like a science experiment. Like, okay, so if I approach this with this, this kind of insight, how does it affect my being? If I take that and approach and then apply it back to the problem, does it get the result I want or not? And the ICF has moved in this direction too. They used to have 3 different sections on action steps, on 3 different things on action steps. They consolidated that to 1, and they emphasized the idea of having an insight as a catalyst for the action. So this is the direction that coaching is going. And it's exciting to me because it just, it underlines a lot of what we know about positive psychology too, where there's an element of it's your own, character strengths and virtues, your own strengths. Are you living a strengths-based life? And this is, it's exciting to me because it feels like these ideas are going to percolate throughout popular culture, and it already is. I mean, we see it. You see evidence of it, and it will eventually get to education. But we'll see.
Yeah.